Technology, the extraterrestrial connection. What I'm going to do is basically go through several different artifacts and kind of jump around from a few different topics. Ancient technology. So we have artifacts that have been found around the world that in their own specific place where they've been located really are somewhat out of context. This one, known as the Antikythera mechanism, was found off the coast of Antikythera. And it's a very interesting device because it's dated back to around 200 BC, and it's more complicated than a modern-day Swiss watch. It has up to 70 different cogs and wheels, all very intricately connected, and it served as two devices. It allowed for navigators to travel the sea and chart their position based upon various star constellations. It was also an astrological device in the sense that it could tell you, if you were born on June 25th, then your sun sign is this, and it means this. And so they attributed some esoteric knowledge to being able to know the positions of the stars based upon relation to your birth date. Now, another part of interesting technology that comes from a little bit earlier back in history, in the 2500 BC era, we find some wall reliefs in ancient Egypt, which some people have claimed to be possible representations of light bulbs. I personally see that based upon the evidence from other cultures, it is very possible that the Egyptians were actually utilizing electricity. Now, mainstream Egyptologists, of course, don't accept this, but there's this one area in Egypt called Dendera, and in this crypt, they have these reliefs that show these light bulbs that, again, under interpretation from what I see, it looks like it's connected to a power device. It's got a filament just like a light bulb would. And this, of course, raises the question as to if they had a light bulb, then, what would they be using these things for? And, of course, more importantly, how would they power such a device? Now, most of the tombs and recesses and crypts in Egypt don't have any carbon or soot, any type of evidence of flame being used in abundance in some of these really dark areas. So that raises the question, how are they able to see and carve these intricate hieroglyphs and drawings? So an alternative theory is that they were using electricity. And to illustrate this, Eric von Daniken had created a model of a light bulb that actually does function with a very low energy source. Recently, I did an on-camera test for the Discovery Channel where I had a clay pottery expert recreate the Baghdad battery, which is another artifact found in that same time frame of around 2500 BC. But it was located in Baghdad, in southern Iraq, Babylon at the time. And very interesting artifact because they found about a dozen of these so far, now labeled as the Baghdad battery. And it's an interesting device because if you fill it with any type of weak acidic acid, grape juice, wine, vinegar, and put a voltmeter on the copper rod and the iron and the copper, then you get a positive charge of electricity. So mainstream science says, well, they weren't actually using this as a battery. It was just to electroplate jewelry. Use it to create chemical processes that allow you to electroplate jewelry and such. But to me, I see a battery. And it makes sense that if we see light bulbs, that it's going to need a power source. And in that same time frame, we find a power source. So to me, it seems very logical that more than likely they were utilizing electricity in 2500 BC. Here's an actual picture of that being tested on camera. Ancient engineering. Now, this is a part where most recently on the History Channel, a show called Ancient Aliens has been divulging deeply into these topics. Very esoteric engineering from various cultures around the world, more specifically in South America, where we have these types of blocks so finely fit together and an intricate design that modern-day sculptors of stone look at this and say, there's no way we could do this. You would need a diamond-tip saw, something very articulated to be able to penetrate granite and these very hard stones. But yet these artifacts exist. And so this is something that even today we're looking at and trying to find the answers. And it seems to me very intriguing that a lot of these stones that are perfectly fit together or have these intricate designs are displaying a type of heating of the rock that we can't figure out how they did it. The term is called vitrification. It just simply means that they either had some type of device that we don't understand yet today that was a laser or some process to be able to heat these rocks to the point that they almost become molten. And then once they're molten, it makes it very easy to imprint or make very fine, intricate, detailed impressions, or Lego-like blocks like we see in Egypt and how the Giza pyramids might have been built. So vitrification is a process of somehow the ancient people had a way of carving rock like it was wet clay and then just letting it harden into place. Now some of this stuff shows actual intricate detail of drilling. Again, you know, if this was molten and it was still wet or almost a magma state and you could pierce through it and make these holes and then it hardened, that seems much more logical than using some advanced drill to somehow make these perfect holes. And really there's another anomaly, is the size of these megalithic stones. Some of these stones are called trilithotons, which means they weigh a minimum of 1,000 tons. And so these are very large rocks that are being pulled from quarry sites, sometimes miles away, and then stacked perfectly to form these trilithoton-sized platforms that we see in Baalbek, in Lebanon, where the Wailing Wall is, and various other places that they've created these monuments to stack very large buildings. But no one knows today how they were able to quarry these stones. Even today, if we were to match with our own technology, large cranes and massive equipment to somehow quarry these rocks out and lift them, all right, well, one, we can't do the size that we see here. You can notice a gentleman standing on the tip of one of these stones. But more importantly, all of the ancient sites, as Giza is an example, where are the cranes? Where are the large megalithic size equipment that we would need to move these rocks? Any type of quarry site comparable to today's technology has large cranes, large equipment, yet we find none of that evidence from the ancient times. So they must have been utilizing some type of technology or something that we don't understand, for one, how they made these perfectly fitting rocks, and two, how they move such large stones. Another thing that we see on all continents is a pyramid connection. It's not just on one continent like in Giza. Pyramids are found all around the world. China, Europe, Africa, Mexico, Giza, or in Egypt. There seems to be certain places on the earth that these monuments are built for a specific purpose. And usually it has something to do with worshiping their gods. But the architecture in the design is usually astronomically orientated. And if it was just one site, great. But we have several sites all around the world that were used to track the stars in a very accurate way that today we still wonder how the ancients were able to do this. Many of the cultures used a time system, which I'll touch on in a minute, that was a celestial time much larger than what we use today. We go around the sun once, and that's a solar year for us, 365 days. But it turns out the ancients used a cycle of precession tracked on a 26,000-year cycle of knowing how cyclic events happen, just like we're aware of, summer, winter, fall, spring, everything repeats. Well, so does a much larger cycle within our universe on a scale of time that the ancients seem to just know and incorporate it into their life, yet we're still trying to relearn this information. So a lot of these pyramids have, again, astronomical meanings, and Eric von Daniken postulates that here in Mexico, these various pyramids are actually specific representations of planets in our solar system, and that there's actually 9 pyramids laid out to represent the planets. Now that crosses over very interestingly enough into something I've studied heavily, which is the Sumerian culture and their knowledge of 12 members in our solar system, but very accurately knowing about the distance between our planets, the color of our planets, and we're talking 6,000 years ago they recorded this information, and now in modern science we confirm it with our knowledge, sending probes to outer space. So it's very interesting to see these pyramids all around the world having some type of very esoteric architecture built into them, and usually astronomically aligned to certain constellations. Now, some of these pyramids in Mexico are actually at the same scale and grandeur at least at the base of the pyramid, as the one in Giza. So there are a lot of similarities, of cross-oceanic similarities of architecture being built. Yet mainstream science says, no, they had no connection. They weren't traveling and seeing each other. Yet the pyramid structures are found all around the world. It almost seems as if everyone has probably heard the idea of Atlantis. So it almost seems that if there was an advanced culture off the recorded history now, that they wouldn't have just been on one continent that somehow sunk into the ocean. They would have been a global civilization. Their technology would have spread around the whole globe. And so that's exactly what we see, is we see megalithic monuments all around the world from a time frame that's off recorded history. The civilizations that ensuing show up in these places, take over these monuments, continue to build upon them, but the initial sites go back much further than what we have in recorded history. So Giza obviously is one of the pinnacle sites of recording information where the accuracy of how this was built is just dumbfounding. First of all, it's almost 1/10 off from true north. Even the Eiffel Tower isn't that accurately situated as far as how we are able to position its building in precision. Now, what's really interesting about the Giza Pyramid is its connection to the Orion constellation. Using star charting software, you can actually tell where the stars are going to be at certain positions in the sky. So tonight I can go out and I can use a little program on my PC like Redshift and see that, oh, look, the North Star is going to be right above my house. Great. Well, it turns out that you can also run this program back in time and go to the date of 10,500 BC, and we find the Orion constellation is exactly paralleled in the sky as a terrestrial map of the Giza Pyramid. So the Giza Pyramids actually are forming a representation of Orion on the ground. And what's also intriguing is at 10,500 BC, the Sphinx is gazing directly east into the constellation of Leo, which is the lion. So somehow the Sphinx and pyramids are forming a terrestrial map of the sky at 10,500 BC. Now, if the Egyptians built the pyramids in 2,500 BC, that would make it even more interesting as to how and why they would have created an alignment 8,000 years previous to their culture. That doesn't make sense. So more than likely, these pyramids are much older than we think. And people like Professor Schock and others who have looked at the geological evidence and the weathering on these monuments around the Giza Plateau, like the Sphinx, clearly say that this is caused by massive amounts of water falling on these rocks. And the last time we had water in abundance in Giza, it's a desert, 10,000 years. So a lot of interesting things start to happen when we look at these monuments in a different light and don't just take the mainstream accepted view from someone like, respectfully, Zahi Hawass, who works in the Giza Plateau and is the forefront of any antiquities discoveries that they might find. He has his own opinion and agenda, just as someone like NASA might. And it's an interesting thing for people to be independent in their approach to this information and come to their own conclusion. Because we have a lot of evidence, and there's pyramids in Egypt where you can see that they were trying to build them, and it didn't quite go off the way they planned. And so they left a couple of sites unattended because it becomes bent, and they were like, well, this isn't acceptable. So an overriding parallel is this idea of celestial time. The astronomical information by the ancient people is it's really overwhelming. What I've studied specifically is the fact that the Sumerian culture, the first civilization we have on Earth, comes out of ancient Iraq. Everyone's heard of Mesopotamia, Babylon. The first culture, on recorded maps of civilizations that we've discovered today, rest on the shoulders of the Sumerians, ancient Iraq. And they were the first ones to divide the heavens into 12 parts and actually create the zodiacal symbols of the divisional heavens, breaking down into 12 parts. And what's interesting is that, the whole idea of, we're in the age of Aquarius or we're in the age of Pisces, the ancients had a very simple way of determining what epoch they were in. You could go out at the time of helechlial rising, which just means that if you walk out early in the morning, right before the sun has crested over the horizon, you can still see like the moon and star constellations. So whatever constellation the sun is rising in front of, then they would say it's the age of Aquarius, the age of Pisces. And it was a very simple way to be able to track the movement of the heavens. They didn't have city lights in ancient times, so they watched the skylights very accurately. So this divisional heaven of zodiacal symbols, which is probably a little easier, is a very interesting thing that I've been studying now for 15 years with the Sumerian culture. But what I've started to realize, and is becoming more clear to me, is that many of these cultures had a much more advanced view than just a divisional breakdown into 12. 26,000 years looking out at a cycle taking place. The Egyptians recorded on various hieroglyphs and wall reliefs this idea of a view of our universe, where it's not just showing the movements of our solar system or of a divisional breakdown of the heavens into 12 parts. It's a much more esoteric view and understanding of cycles taking place. So, it's an intriguing anomaly that somehow all these ancient cultures based their calendar system, the Mayans, the Egyptians, the Sumerians, many of these ancient cultures had a knowledge of this 26,000 year of precession, where every 26,000 years the Earth on its own rotational axis as it spins, it'll degrade its orbit, its wobble by a degree or so every 26,000 years. Very slight change, but it does change the movement of how we see the position of the stars from our representation on Earth. And somehow the ancients knew this and tracked this cycle. Yet today we've lost this information. People are interested in it now because you hear 2012 and they're like, ooh, the Mayans knew that the end of time in 2012. Well, this all ties into this. Somehow they had cyclical knowledge on a scale much more in longevity than we consider summer, spring, fall, winter. It's going to get cold again next year. It happens every year. They knew that things were going to happen in a cyclical basis. And it's a very intriguing way to look at how they based their time and how they did a lot of their activities. Here's just a little bit more of a detailed view of some of these artifacts. You can see the intricacy in the design that they went to bring out the detail. So the Sumerian culture, again, this is a Sumerian artifact. This is roughly 4,000 years old, carved into a semi-precious stone. And you can see various constellations being represented by their animal or zodiacal symbols here in this element. Now, another thing that we see across various cultures is the power of flight. And this one is really fun for the whole idea of the ancient astronaut theory, because we can see this happening repetitively in various times in history. In more recent times, we have World War II as an example. We fly to these remote areas that are populated by aboriginals and have never seen technology or white people. And all of a sudden, these U.S. soldiers land in a prop plane, get out and light up a cigarette, hold up a voice recorder to the aboriginal and record their voice and play it back to them. They don't understand. They think these people are gods. They think the thing that they just landed in is a living creature. And so they build straw models of the aircraft, and they scrape away runways, and they sit and worship these idols and hope that they'll return once they leave. Another thing is sometimes during wartime they drop cargo shipments into the troops camps, supplies and refurbishments and such. And sometimes these shipments would not land in the troops and would land in the middle of the tribe, and they and they crack it open, and it's got all these food and weapons, and they thought this is stuff from the gods, So the whole idea of cargo cults is a term where ancient man looked at just us coming to visit them and didn't understand, these aboriginals didn't understand technology. We can see the same thing playing out thousands of years ago, where a lot of the artifacts and things and descriptions being told to us by the ancients is limited by their understanding of technology. So they're not going to show a spacecraft and say the technological craft was hovering in the sky. They're going to be like, there was a chariot of fire. They're going to give it wings and say it had the power of flight. Now, that doesn't mean it was an actual person flapping down or that it was a circle with wings in the sky. They're symbolically trying to represent that, and I'll show this point more in a minute. But these are various artifacts from the Sumerian culture, ancient Iraq, and you can always see this mystical thing in the backdrop of a winged disc. We see this also in other cultures like the Egyptians, sun god Ra. But this originally disseminated from Sumer and spread out to many other Middle Eastern cultures. And it's a consistent way of them saying, we were visited by our gods. Now, the gods that they discussed today, we would call extraterrestrials. Physical beings, technologically, also more spiritually advanced than us. They come and visit us, and they depart their wisdom. These are artifacts, again, from the Sumerian culture. This is Ishtar, or also Inanna, and you can look at the detail and complexity. Let's see if I have a front view of her. I don't. The complexity and design and the intricacy that they went in detail to sculpt these things thousands of years ago. She liked to roam the skies of earth, as the tales go, and she would choose various males to take into her sky abode, but then they would never come back. She found one king to be of interest, Gilgamesh, and was like, hey, come up to my sky abode. And he's like, thank you, but no thanks. Seems like no one ever seems to return. So these are stories recorded as myths and shown as artifacts, but is it really mythology, or in their simple way are they trying to explain events that took place? Again, a Sumerian god inscribed in a wall in Iran and Persepolis. The intricacy of design, this pattern of a winged being. What are they trying to show us? Egyptian culture, we have the Isis and various other references like Ra that show this winged being. But we also see various artifacts that show representation of the power of flight. Now, this is a bird model to Egyptologists. They say it's a representation of a bird. But when you look at the aerodynamics of the wings, everything here is proportional to an airplane, but not proportional to a bird in nature. And these artifacts, of course, are all around the world, not just in Egypt, but across continents in South America, pre-Columbian plane models that were labeled as insects. These are insects. Giorgio Tsoukalos, who's speaking, I believe, tomorrow, has a great little pin. I should have worn mine. Darn it, he gave me one as a gift. And it's a great little representation that it looks like a plane. Yet they've labeled it as an insect. So you do have to wonder, it's not just one or two items, but several across cultures. This was found in Turkey, recognized by Zecharia Sitchin in his book Divine Encounters. Awesome book. And he had to convince the curator to say, look, I understand you don't think it's a rocket ship, you don't know what it is, but put it on display and let the public decide. And that's exactly what they did. And they called it an unknown artifact. Sitchin calls it the headless spaceman. You can see very clearly rocket-like characteristics. A gentleman seated in some type of rocket-like engine. He's holding gears, he's wearing a suit, and there's even representations of an engine in the back. I mean, for an ancient culture to just think of something like that, I don't think is possible. They had to have seen something, just like the cargo cult people, when the soldiers come to the Aboriginal tribes in prop planes, they make a model of a prop plane. They don't understand the prop plane, but they're fascinated by it. Same thing with the ancient people, seeing beings visiting in craft. They might not have understood these craft, but they went to great lengths to depict them for us. This was just an interesting artifact I found in doing some research where it looks like someone's ascending or descending there, and it's kind of interesting. So ancient UFOs, again, just going into a more advanced representation of the power. To me, these aren't just mythological representations. They're doing their best with their limited understanding of technology to represent what they saw. So this one is a really great, the St. Giovanni picture of painting of Madonna, very well-known fresco. And it's just a very simple little thing to look over her shoulder and see that there's a gentleman with a dog looking at something in the sky. What is that? The artist went to very great detail to represent a luminous object that's catching the attention of people looking at it in the sky. And what could that be other than, it's not a falling rock, it's not a meteorite, it looks like some type of what we would call today UFO. And these types of imagery come throughout Renaissance artwork, throughout history. These are described as glowing shields that were attacking them from the sky. So the Sumerian culture is really where I've focused a lot of my research in understanding this culture's interaction with these beings they called Anunnaki. And the term in Sumerian, Anunnaki, just simply means those who from heaven come to earth. And what I found very interesting is that I was raised as a Christian. And so a lot of the things taught to me in the Bible, when reading the work of Zecharia Sitchin and other mainstream scholars that look into the Sumerian culture, I started to see a connection, just as mainstream science recognizes today, as these artifacts are on display, that the stories in the New Testament and the Old Testament have scientific fact, that there's actual stone tablet versions of these tales that still exist today. And when I studied these versions, rather than the New King James Version of the condensed tale told, the original tales tell a much more detailed explanation of man's interaction with a time when they lived amongst their living gods, and happened to be taking place in one civilization called Sumer, known as Mesopotamia, Babylon, today's Iraq. 6,000 years ago it was called Sumer. Now, the most infamous scholar that has divulged into this research is Zecharia Sitchin. God rest his soul. Zecharia Sitchin has done over 50 years, 50 years of research into Semitic languages, and specifically ancient Iraq. Wrote a series of books called the Earth Chronicles, and throughout my life I will continue to cite his research because it's the best to date of any ancient astronaut researcher I've seen. There are a lot out there, but Sitchin was the only one to go microscopic detail into one culture and really bring out the details. And we need other scholars, like John Major Jenkins, who's focused on the Mayans. We need other scholars to grab hold of a specific culture and dive into it and get all these details out so that we can cross-compare the various cultures. So Sitchin has done a very good job of starting at the Sumerian culture and then seeing these other similarities in other cultures. Now, specifically, again, Iraq then was called Mesopotamia. Right between the Tigris and Euphrates rivers, we have this fertile strip of land. And from this culture, we have over 100 of the first needed for high civilization that we still attribute to the Sumerian culture. Most importantly is writing. They had the first system of writing. We think we're cool with our 26-letter alphabet. The Sumerian cuneiform script was 400 characters. And this is the first alphabet that we have recorded on Earth as a complete language of writing. 400 characters. Their system of writing was a stylus, looked like an oversized screwdriver, and they would twist it and turn it in the clay and make all these symbols in wet clay. And then they would stick that clay into a stove and heat it up into stone, literally keying that phrase, writing in stone. They sometimes recorded information on semi-precious stones. And what's really interesting about the Sumerian collection is that many of these artifacts are parallels to biblical tales. As an example, the British Museum has thousands of these tablets not on display. Some of them are on display, and one of them, as an example, is labeled the Flood Tablet. And it was discovered by the assistant curator to the British Museum in 1899, or just into the new century, 1900. His name was George Smith, and doing an excavation in a city of Ur, ancient Iraq, he found a tablet, and while he starts reading it, it's literally word for word the Noah's Ark tale. However, it's an Anunnaki, a Sumerian god, speaking to a Sumerian whose name is Utanpishtim, and he's telling him, hey, you need to build a large craft, a ship. It's going to be this length, the exact measurements. Take all your family and animals in the area onto this craft because there's going to be a large flood. And, the gentleman freaked out and ran, saying, my God, look what I found. So he had found the actual flood tale in its original form, still written in stone. It existed. But it was a much more detailed story, a part of a much more long 11 tablets, actually 12 tablets, but the 12th was broken off. But this tale was a much more intricate explanation of what we get in a condensed version of the New Testament. It tells you why we have a great flood and why the gods, plural, chose not to save us. And it speaks of another planet that comes into our inner part of our solar system and causes gravitational effects. And at one point in our past, it cracked off part of our ice sheet, like an ice dropping into a glass of water. It instantly raised the water levels on Earth. So the Sumerians have very interesting information that, when looked at through the religious tones, we have the basis of where these stories originated, the actual first versions. So scientifically, looking at that story, it does take on some interesting context. Now, so here's another tablet just showing some Sumerian writing. They went to great lengths to also record astronomical information. They tracked the heavens over hundreds of years. There were high priests that would take this information as sacred information and would follow it and pass it down to priests over time. A Sumerian priest that could read certain tablets could tell you 50 years in advance on one specific day there'd be a solar eclipse. So another part of their legacy is what we still use today as mathematics. They had a base math of 60, and they actually used the number 6 and 10, sexagesimal math, 6 and 10, to do a very intricate division of small numbers and very large numbers. They were the first ones to divide the heavens into 12 parts, and they were the first ones to denote 360 degrees to a circle. Now, an interesting part about the Sumerian mathematics is tied to how they learned all this. They say, if you ask a Sumerian, well, how do you know all this stuff? How did you learn all this information? They say, well, everything we learned, we were taught by the Anunnaki, those who from heaven come to earth. And what's interesting about the Anunnaki is that they say they come from another planet within our solar system that's the 12th member of our solar system. And I'm going to touch on this more in a minute. It'll get clearer. But imagine that we have 12 members in our solar system, and this 12th planet is where the Anunnaki come from. They come to Earth, and they teach us all this advanced knowledge. Some very interesting similarities around the number 12, however. Their whole basis of what they've taught us revolves around them coming from the 12th planet. Well, we have 12 hours in a day, 12 inches in a foot, 12 in a dozen, 12 months in a year, the 12 tribes of Israel, the 12 disciples of Jesus, the 12 Greek Olympians. All of this symbology comes from the representation of the knowledge learned by the Sumerians from the Anunnaki, coming from the 12th planet. So it's really interesting, some of these things can be tracked through history as to the origins of where they come from. This was an interesting artifact that actually shows the symbol for Earth and its crescent moon. So you see 7 dots in Earth's moon. And then you also see a symbol of a cross and its moon, which was to represent Nibiru. Now, the Sumerians represented the planet of where the Anunnaki came from as a large glowing cross in the sky. And this is 4,000 years before Jesus on the cross. And they're representing their home world of their gods as a glowing cross in the sky. So obviously, in more recent times, we look at these stories in the Bible of angels and wonder, is there a ufology overtone that we're missing? That they were actually not just traveling in chariots, but were being represented as beings that had the power of flight, but we didn't quite understand it at the time. And there's some very interesting things and characteristics about the Anunnaki from the Sumerian culture. Everyone's seen a representation of an angel, and sometimes it has a halo over its head. The Anunnaki actually claimed they had a glow about them. There was, information recorded by the Sumerians that if you saw an Anunnaki standing in front of you, you'd say, he's got kind of a glow about them. Now, their planet was a very luminous planet, very bright. Maybe it's the simple thing if you are a product of what you eat. We see here on Earth natural luminescence in insects and various animals in the ocean that can produce light naturally. So the whole idea of an aura and this halo of light from angels, again, is a misrepresentation of the Anunnaki having a literal light glow about them. So that's just a very interesting parallel where, again, me being raised as a Christian, it was always, they came down from heaven. It's never, all cultures say that they were visited by their gods, and they never say that their gods came from the mountains or from across the lake. They always came from the skies. So these are very interesting representations coming from the Sumerian culture of these Anunnaki. And there is some humor here, too, of what we can see from today's representations of culture, that here it is, a Sumerian king on a platform, and you can see that an Anunnaki is coming to meet him for some symbolic meeting. But below that, you can see this platform is being held up by all the people from the civilization. I would claim these to probably be taxpayers that are holding this up to make this happen, which isn't too far from the truth from today. So, a lot of these representations of winged beings and the power of flight, to me, is a representation of their limited understanding of technology and just trying to say, we had people just like us flying and visiting us, and they were coming from the heavens. Another, just kind of a pulled out shot of this of these wall reliefs in Iran and Persepolis, and you can see the detail that they go to in showing these, and always, symbolically is that winged disc hovering overhead. So the symbolic reference of these Anunnaki is intriguing, because I don't think that they were actually winged beings flapping down from the skies. The angels in the Bible were not flapping down. They were symbolically showing they had the power of flight. Now, what we do see here is another interest, is you can see he's holding the water of life and the tree of life symbolically, but around his wrist looks like a nice watch. I don't know if that's just coincidence, but the detail of what they would probably be using if they had technology might be that the Anunnaki had devices on them, and the Sumerians, not understanding, at least went to the detail of representing that here. But what is interesting is that when we look at the same modern symbology of what we use today, for instance, for the first landing on the moon, I seriously doubt that we were landing birds on the moon, meaning 6,000 years from now, they're not going to look at the Apollo 11 and say, were they landing birds on the moon? No. We were symbolically saying that we had the power of flight. And so everyone's famous with that saying, Houston, the eagle has landed. So we were using symbolic representation, just as the ancients did, to say they had the power of flight. Okay, so this kind of touches into some of the Sumerian information for a question of great interest that a lot of people do take for fact, that there was a great flood. And, we have evidence around the world of pieces of, artifacts, these maps as an example, the Perry Reese map and the Charles Hapgood map, which I'll flip to in a minute. I can't read the text from here, unfortunately, but you can get a glimpse at that for a moment. Very interesting maps that show detail of our coastlines, global coastlines, at a time when they were all covered by at least a mile thick of ice at the polar caps, like today. Yet the topography is accurately mapped out in maps that are on gazelle hides from 1500. So the dates on some of this creation of these maps is really an anomaly. And they accurately show the coastline and the animals and the type of things that you find on these different continents, to the point where scholars look at this and say, well, how would they have had the ability to be at such a high point in space above the earth to accurately write out this topography? And it's not just one map, but several that accurately show the topography of Antarctica, the South and North Pole. And this is under a mile thick of ice. You need ground-penetrating radar to be able to see the actual landmass rather than the snow or the ice. So someone had to tell the ancient people, someone told them this initially, and it was obviously carried as sacred information by navigators. The flood tablet, the one I had mentioned earlier, here it is. This is on display in the British Museum. It's a physical artifact that does exist. And again, it's a very interesting look into our past to validate mythological or religious information that under a new context starts to take on reality, real artifacts, real locations, and possible real beings that did visit us. Giants upon the earth, again, representations by the Sumerians much more accurate of showing beings that are larger than us and having them being renowned, giving them prominence. So this is a Sumerian king being visited by Sumerians, but again, you look at the representation of giants upon the earth, it's an interesting, consistent thing that we do see from ancient peoples, holding their gods or these beings that visited them, in high respect.